At some point in the early 1950s, you could not walk through a major American city without seeing her face. It looked out from magazine covers, from billboard advertisements, from the glossy pages of newspapers and Sunday supplements. Department stores used her image to sell soap and stockings and cigarettes. Fan mail arrived by the thousands. Photographers followed her the way they would later follow rock stars. She was not a film actress, not a singer, not a politician's wife. She was a model, which in that era meant something different from what it means now, something closer to a national symbol than a profession. Her name was Anita Colby, and in the decade between 1935 and 1945, no woman in the United States was photographed more often. Then she stopped. Not gradually, not after a slow decline or a quiet retirement. She stepped back, reorganized her life around a set of choices that the press found genuinely baffling, and became to the public that had consumed her image for 20 years, essentially invisible. She lived another half-century after that disappearance. She was sharp, active, opinionated, and well-connected until very near the end. She just wasn't famous anymore. And she had, by most accounts, decided she preferred it that way. This is not a tragedy. That's worth saying up front, because stories about beautiful women who leave public life tend to get filed automatically under loss, under waste, under the melancholy category of what might have been. Anita Colby's story resists that filing. She was one of the few people in mid-century American celebrity culture who looked at the machine she had helped build and made a clear-eyed decision about how long she wanted to run it. The decision cost her something. It probably cost her more than she admitted, but it was hers. She was born Anita Cunahan in 1914 in Washington, D.C., the daughter of a cartoonist named Bud Fisher, who was, in his moment, enormously famous. Fisher created the comic strip Mutt and Jeff in 1907, one of the first daily newspaper comics in American history, and by the time Anita was born, he was wealthy, celebrated, and entirely absent from domestic life. Her parents' marriage collapsed early. She was raised largely by her mother and took her stepfather's surname Colby, while her father's name floated in the background as a piece of context she would neither trade on nor entirely escape. What she did inherit from Fisher was an instinct for spectacle and an unsentimental understanding of how attention works. He had built a career on it. She would build a different kind of career on the same insight, expressed through a completely different medium. She began modeling in New York in her early 20s, and the speed with which she moved through the industry's lower ranks to its top tier was unusual even by the standards of a field that sometimes generates sudden arrivals. By 1937, she was one of the most recognizable faces in American advertising. By 1940, she was appearing on the covers of Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, and Life in the same calendar year, which was not something most models achieved in a career, let alone a 12-month span. The face helped. This is an uncomfortable thing to write about a woman whose life had enormous substance beyond her appearance. But it would be dishonest to discuss her career without acknowledging what photographers said about working with her: that she was unusually easy to light, that the camera produced consistent results with her in a way it didn't with most subjects, that she had what Edward Steichen, who photographed her multiple times, described as a face that looked like it was already thinking about something interesting. The slight asymmetry that other photographers sometimes tried to correct, she didn't bother correcting. It made her look real, which, in an era of heavily retouched, idealized advertising imagery, was its own kind of novelty. But the face was never the whole story. What set Colby apart from contemporaries who had comparable looks was that she also understood the business she was in. She tracked her own rates, negotiated her own contracts, kept detailed records of who had used her image and where and for how long. At a time when most models worked through agents who took a significant cut and managed all the financial relationships, Colby ran a large portion of her career herself. She was not the first model to do this. She was the first to do it at the scale she operated. The income was substantial. By the early 1940s, she was earning, by various estimates, somewhere between $150,000 and $200,000 a year, numbers that require some translation to make sense. A skilled factory worker in 1942 earned around $2,000 annually. A mid-level executive at a large corporation might earn $10,000. What Colby was making put her in a category occupied almost exclusively by major film stars and a handful of corporate presidents. She was, by any reasonable measure, one of the highest-earning women in the United States, and she had achieved this through a profession that most people at the time did not consider serious work. She took the money seriously, even when the work itself sometimes didn't seem to. She invested, she saved, she bought property. She was not, by any account from people who knew her in those years, extravagant in the ways that the press sometimes implied she was. The fur coats and the elegant apartments were real, but they were also, in part, professional equipment. The image she maintained was inseparable from the income the image generated. When she spent money on looking like Anita Colby, she was spending money on her own brand in exactly the way a fashion house spends money on its storefronts. David O. Selznick noticed her in 1944, which in itself said something about how famous she had become. Selznick was, that year, arguably the most powerful producer in Hollywood, still riding the extraordinary commercial and cultural wave of Gone with the Wind. He had a specific problem. His contract actresses, Jennifer Jones, chief among them, were not, in his assessment, being developed or handled in ways that made the most of what they could be. They needed, he decided, someone who understood image, someone who could work with them on presentation, on how they moved through public life, on the construction of a persona that would hold up under the kind of scrutiny major film stars faced. He hired Colby as director of femininity, a title that sounds, from this distance, either absurd or deeply patronizing. In practice, the role was something closer to a combination of publicist, image consultant, and executive producer of the personal brand. She worked directly with Jones, whom she apparently liked and whose career problems she took seriously. She also worked with Ingrid Bergman, Dorothy McGuire, and Rhonda Fleming, among others. The Hollywood years lasted roughly 2 years in their formal capacity, though her connections to the film industry persisted much longer. What she took away from the experience, by her own later account, was a detailed understanding of what sustained fame actually costs the people inside it. She watched women she had worked with be consumed by the machinery of celebrity in ways that damaged them. She watched the press cycle that could make a person visible also make them, over time, something less than a person. An image that the public felt entitled to. A face that no longer belonged entirely to the face's owner. She did not, to be precise, say any of this in exactly these terms. What she said, in various interviews over the decades after she left her public career, was something quieter and more practical. That she had done the work she wanted to do, that she had made the money she needed to make, and that she had watched enough people try to extend a public career past its natural point to have no interest in doing the same thing herself. She framed it as a business decision as much as anything else. The sentimentality that journalists often wanted from her on the subject, the confession of loss, the admission that she sometimes missed it, the wistful backward look, she generally declined to provide. There were relationships, several serious ones, none of which ended in marriage. She came close, by various accounts, at least twice. One relationship, in the early 1950s, with a man whose name she declined to make public during her lifetime, appears to have ended badly enough to have affected her for some time afterward. Beyond that, the record is thin and partly by design. She was careful about what she said about her private life. And the press, after a certain point, was no longer paying close enough attention to push. What she did from the mid-1950s onward was work in ways that generated less public attention. She wrote, she consulted for fashion and advertising companies. She maintained relationships with people across entertainment, politics, and business, and those relationships were, by all available evidence, the central structure of her life in those decades. She knew everyone. She was invited everywhere. She simply no longer built a career on being seen. The transformation confused people who had watched her earlier. The modeling industry she had helped define was, by the late 1950s, producing a new generation of faces, Susie Parker, Davima, later Twiggy. And the business had changed significantly from what it had been in Colby's peak years. But Colby herself had not declined into that change. She had preceded it. She stepped back before the industry's transformation would have made stepping back feel like a defeat. And this timing was either very lucky or very deliberate. And given everything else that is known about how she operated, it was almost certainly deliberate. There is a photograph from 1962 taken at a party in New York. Colby is standing in conversation with two people whose faces are partly turned away. She looks exactly as she had looked in her modeling years. Same posture, same quality of attention, same apparent comfort with being in a room full of people who were watching her. But she is not, in this photograph, the subject. She is a guest at a party. The camera caught her incidentally. That shift from the image as the point to the image as an incidental byproduct of a life being lived was what she had been moving toward for years. And this photograph, which she probably never saw or knew existed, captures it precisely. She gave relatively few interviews in her later decades. The ones she gave were consistent in their refusal to perform either satisfaction or regret. She did not describe her modeling career as shallow or as the thing she had escaped. She described it as work she had done well, in a period when she was the right person to do it. When asked whether she wished she had continued longer, she tended to redirect toward specifics. A particular campaign she had enjoyed, a particular photographer whose approach she had found interesting, rather than answering the general question. Whether this was genuine equanimity or a very good performance of it is impossible to know from the outside. It may have been both. What is clear from people who knew her in the 1960s and 1970s is that she was not a diminished version of the person she had been. She was, by multiple accounts, one of the most interesting people any of them had known. Engaged, funny, direct, and in possession of a detailed understanding of how image and power interact that she had assembled over 30 years of watching both from the inside. She gave advice freely. She was not particularly interested in receiving it. She died in 1992 at 78. The obituaries mentioned her modeling career, her time at Selznick, the title the press had given her in the 1940s, The Face, and the fact that she had been for a decade the most photographed woman in America. Most of the obituaries were fairly brief. The cultural memory of her peak years had faded in ways that other figures from the same era had managed to prevent or delay. She had not, in the decades between her public life and her death, done the work of keeping herself remembered. This was presumably a choice made by the same person who had made every other choice in her career with clear eyes and specific intentions. There are arguments to be made about what was lost. A woman of her intelligence operating in the 1940s had a very limited set of fields available to her, and she navigated those fields with more skill and self-determination than almost anyone working alongside her. What might she have done with the career options available to women 30 years later, or 50? The question is genuinely interesting. It is also unanswerable, and she would probably have found it beside the point. She was not a person, from what can be gathered across the records she left, who spent significant time on questions about what she might have been in different circumstances. She seems to have been occupied enough with what she actually was. The photographs still exist, several thousand of them, scattered across archives, magazine collections, the digitized back issues of publications that covered her for a decade. In them, she looks, as she always looked in photographs, like she is thinking about something interesting. The thing she was thinking about is not available to us. That is entirely appropriate